Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Haifong. Nuclear war is back in the geopolitical landscape as recent moves made by Donald Trump and his administration, as well as Russia's response, have sent a clear message that Vladimir Putin is preparing for the worst, despite the enthusiasm of latest talks. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is now fully dead, with Russia getting rid of its own self-imposed restrictions, and the START treaty could very well be next. While the mood has softened, Putin's aim, while the mood has softened and claims of a deal acceptable to Russia has been supposedly offered by the U.S., huge problems remain. The U.S. Air Force recently sent a nuclear sniffer just off of Russia's territory, and Russia has not budged in its overall goal to win this conflict. Our next guest will help us parse through the truth behind the whiplash of the reality, and that is former British diplomat and geopolitical analyst Alastair Crooke. Alastair, thanks so much for joining me today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Yes. Well, you recently actually wrote an article talking about recent developments, Alastair, on your Conflicts Forum Substack. And while I pull that up for people to see, I want your reaction to the latest developments. There has been talks between, of course, Witkoff and Putin that have just ended. However, just before this, we saw Donald Trump's nuclear submarine threat that then was followed by Russia announcing Reshniks and serial production, as well as the fact that Russia's foreign ministry has said that their own restrictions on intermediate range missiles has been let go of because of U.S. moves in particular, as well as NATO moves over the last several months to years. So talk about these escalations in this context as you've been following what's been going on in this conflict.
I think this nuclear threat, so-called, of the two subs being, if you like, nuclear or higher class submarines, being, as Trump said, positioned close to Russia, misunderstands and miscasts the whole issue, and therefore the Russians, I don't think, will take this very seriously. These Ohio class submarines, essentially nuclear-equipped, nuclear-capable submarines, are second strike weapons. That is to say, after Russia putatively had made a first strike on America, the whole point of these submarines, which are deployed all the time, always, there are already two there. It's not as if he sent any purpose in sending any more. They lie quietly on the ocean floor. Quietly, because any noise, any engine start will be detected by the Russians, who have acoustics across the whole area, and they have killer subs who will follow these. So to suggest you're going to send them out in the open on the seas in Kellogg, the supposed advisor to Trump was sort of whispering, well, we'll send the whole fleet and they can cruise up and down. I mean, the whole point is that they are not flaunted. And no one of the Russians don't know where they are. That is the whole point of a second strike force, that it lies quietly, doing nothing, on the ocean floor for a period, maybe 2 months or whatever it is, and then they're relieved by another two submarines. And the point of this is really just to be there in case of a Russian first strike. That's all, not to threaten Russia. And so I think all of the Russians who know a little bit about, nuclear geopolitics will understand that both Kellogg and Trump, what they were saying was so ridiculous. Must have had the Pentagon pulling their hair out, saying, oh yes, what, you don't want us to send our whole second strike capability out in the open so the Russians can know exactly where everything is. Come on, that is the opposite of what we would do. So I don't think they would have taken this very, very seriously. I think what it has done is given a peg to Putin. To go back to a topic he's been on for a long time. It's been on his agenda a long time, and this has been a peg to really say, okay, well, you have been placing intermediate and short-range missiles into Europe. Yes, the INF treaty is out of, if you like, is no longer valid at the moment, but we have been unofficially observing it and keeping to it. But now we're dropping that. We are going to actually have to respond to this by our own positioning of short and intermediate range missiles. And at the same time, no coincidence, I suspect, he mentioned the Oreshnik missile, not nuclear, but a hypersonic missile that can reach anywhere in Europe, is now in serial production and is in the hands of the Russian army and therefore is available. And the great thing, if you like, is that it is much more effective than a nuclear weapon because of its accuracy. That's the game changer, is its accuracy. It can really pinpoint. It can pinpoint, MI6 headquarters or the Mossad headquarters and strike it precisely without collateral damage around it and destroy it utterly. So, and as I say, it's not nuclear and it can have multiple warheads. And now that's in serial production, mass production. And so they're changing it. And what Russians seem to be doing, two things. They've said, first of all, we need to be aware that in the Pacific and that area, Russia is also vulnerable too. But there we have our ally, North Korea. But in Europe, we are going to create a new security architecture. And, this is not something that is sort of a threat or a counter threat. It is a new architecture because this is what Russia has said from the outset. Putin made this clear in the speech on the 14th of June. What is necessary, the root cause of the problem in Ukraine is, if you like, the lack of a security architecture which safeguards Russia and Russian interests. And we need to get round to the architecture. Well, the West is just ignoring the treaty and going on its own way. So Russia has decided that it's going to do its own architecture. Now, will this prompt the West to do something that it sorely needs to do, which is to reinstate or renegotiate an intermediate and short-range nuclear missile treaty, or not? At the moment, there seems no interest in this at all. You may recall, just to underline it, that the United States has put missiles both in Poland and Romania. And during those talks, the first talks that did take place between Biden and Putin, then after the talks, Blinken made it clear to Lavrov that the Americans intended to put these missiles in Ukraine. Well, the flight time from Romania or from Poland is about 7 or 8 minutes to Moscow. If you put them in Ukraine, it's about 2 or 3 minutes. And this is just not acceptable. And this is why those talks at that time became completely broken.
Yeah. Yeah. And, last time we spoke, Alastair, we talked about the US-backed Ukrainian attack on the strategic bombers. And now we're in a slightly different situation with as you said, the nuclear treaty that Russia never pulled out of the INF, now being deemed irrelevant for Russia. But there's also this development, I don't know if you saw, even as talks were happening, positive talks on both sides are saying they were positive between U.S. and the U.S. There was a nuclear sniffer of the U.S. Senate. I'm not familiar actually even with this terminology, but the U.S. Air Force sent one. It's a plane designed to track nuclear testing in the atmosphere, and it flew close to Russia's nuclear bases in the northwest of the country on the same day that Witkoff and Putin were meeting. And it took off from the RAF, Mildenhall, a UK base, and it traveled along the coast of West Norway. So I'm curious, what do you make of this? How do you see these kind of moves? And you wrote in your article that Russia is creating a new strategic architecture in the absence of international restrictions. How does this all relate? Because there is enthusiasm right now with these talks, but you've said that you've seen very little movement on the U.S. side. Is this another verification of that?
What I think this was about was that the Americans, just as the Russians, after what happened, after Trump's and Kellogg's rather silly statements about sort of putting all their subs out on the surface and sailing them around Russia, I mean, it followed, of course, as you rightly said, the spider's web attacks on their strategic nuclear capabilities, their key strategic nuclear capacities. This was the, if you like, the attack done from drones and insertions, pre-positioned weapons that attacked their strategic bomber. Of course, Russia will be looking very closely and saying, well, why were they doing that? Is there an attack intended? Is this what they are planning, to attack our strategic weapons? If so, are they planning some first strike capacity? You have to think about these things if you're president of Russia or any big state. So they undoubtedly are doing that. And then they've thought about it because, too, the second thing that has affected the Russian thinking about this, and it really shocked them what happened at those spiders' webs attack, because, these were sort of inserted in advance and launched remotely at their nuclear bomber fleet. And they realize that, they're very open to this, but more so because we've had this succession, a decapitation strike against Hezbollah, an attempted decapitation strike against the Houthis in the Yemen, and then an actual decapitation strike in Iran against the line commanders of Iran and their nuclear scientists. So this means that Russia has got to think very carefully about what is this new form of warfare that the United States is preparing and thinking about. So you have to put that as a context and then understand what is happening. Clearly, Russia is looking to see if there's any change in the alert status of Western forces after that statement, however silly they thought it to be by Trump, that they would be looking to see, is there a change in status? Are the West mobilizing? Is the West mobilizing in some way, preparing for action? And if they don't see that, then they will take it easy. But as I'm saying, I don't think that this INF proposal was directly connected with this statements about the submarines. It was something Putin has had up his sleeve for some time. I've actually, heard it for a long time. He's wanted to get back because the intermediate missiles that the West has been putting, and they are planning to put them into Germany next. I mean, this is, threatening existentially Russia. It can't just ignore it and just go on, observing treaties that are no longer in existence and pretending to be content about it. It has to react, and that's what it's doing. But it's not, if you like, a threatening act. This is a defensive act, essentially a new security architecture to make Russia safer.
Yeah, and you talked about in your article, Alastair, the Russian Foreign Ministry was the one who came out with this statement, and they had a litany of examples, Germany being one of those. But you also mentioned the Asia Pacific too, and there was cited examples, for example, the Philippines. Could you talk about this and how it might influence the Russia-U.S. Posture now? Because there is, as I said, there has been a little bit more enthusiasm around these talks. But how much do these nuclear kind of questions factor into the relations between both sides amid this existential conflict for Russia in Ukraine?
Well, it means that I think that the position of North Korea becomes crucial, because then Russia can, if you like, base missiles in North Korea, its ally there, that both cover the Asia-Pacific region and even can stretch to the United States, even intermediate missiles, not the missiles covered, if you like, by the START treaties. So it's a really important change in architecture, and it's a change to a global position that Russia is taking on this issue. What is the effect of it? It is tying much more closely China, Russia, India, Iran, as amongst others, as the main elements. And they see now, and this is why the tariffs have become such a big issue, because they can see, the tariffs in India, which are now going to be at 50% for the time being. Trump says he may take them off, who knows? But with these tariffs, and they've said, and the US ambassador to NATO says there's going to be a lot more secondary sanctions on states that have relations with Russia. Come on, this is real economic war. This is war against the BRICS. I mean, we call it tariffs. They're sanctions. They're it's a weaponizing of tariffs for geopolitical purposes. And so the BRICS are having to react. India has already started to react against it. And other states are going to come together. And BRICS and others have the ability to push back. I don't think the actual sanctions that I don't know if they've actually been announced on Russia, if there are sanctions announced in Russia. That wasn't clear to me when I looked this morning. But if they are, I mean, they will have very little effect on, China or India. China's been absolutely adamant on this. They've told America in no uncertain terms, I mean, bluntly for Chinese, who tend to be very courteous in their language and polite, but they've said, listen, when it comes to what we do in terms of buying our oil from either Russia or Iran, that's our business. It's not your business. We'll talk to you about direct trade relations between China and America, but stay out of these other areas. We are going to continue to have our energy security from Russia and Iran. So we're seeing a big sort of, if you like, pushback starting because it's now been made so clear with these tariffs that the United States is pursuing an economic war against the BRICS, and the BRICS have to find a way. It's no longer about economics or trade positions. This is a way that they have to fight for their autonomy and fight for their sovereignty, or else see it disappear and become, simply dependence on whether the United States says you can trade with this or that. And then they lose They lose then their sources of energy supply. Secure energy is no longer available. So it's a big issue. This the sanctions, and the ones on India particularly, are just very symbolic of this economic war that is being waged on the BRICS states, and they now see very clearly. Either they react or they lose their autonomy.
Yeah, and President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, said that he is going to, because Brazil itself for example, in BRICS, doesn't really have power to negotiate with the United States, that he's going to be trying to organize BRICS states together to confront these tariffs. But Alastair, as you were talking, it brought me to Trump's initial reactions. He's been being slammed for these secondary tariffs, or we should call them sanctions, on India over Russia. And many in the Western media are saying, why are you singling out India versus China? This was his answer.
So let's see what happens over the next. Yeah, you're going to see a lot more. So this is a taste. You're going to see a lot more. You're going to see so much secondary sanctions. Yes, ma'am. Let me.
So there's a lot more to come, according to Trump. And I wanted your reaction to this too, because we have the nuclear, of course, tensions between the U.S. and Russia. We have the Ukraine conflict, which there are many terms still that have not been resolved. And then President Trump issued an executive order recently, where you're exactly right, Alastair. There hasn't been a statement of more sanctions on Russia, particularly, but in the secondary sanctions announcement, he called Russia to an unusual and extraordinary threat to the security and foreign policy of the United States. And it says, among other things, the importation from the U.S. of certain products of the Russian Federation, including oil, petroleum fuels, oils, and products of the distillation, will be targeted in these secondary sanctions. So, Alastair, how does this all factor into what often is this swinging back and forth between very cold, I feel like over the last several months, very cold talks between U.S. and Russia, not much happening, and then of late there's been more. So how does this all relate? Because it's mixed messaging.
Well, you'll have to parse it. I mean, on the face of it, it looks, very belligerent. But actually, what I think it relates to, but this is just my personal opinion, but what I think it relates to is that, in fact, the president, although he has many executive, if you like, abilities enshrined in the Constitution, that of tariffs and revenue raising is still, and constitutionally, lies with Congress. He is getting around this by invoking an emergency act, saying that the United States is in an emergency, and under the Emergency Act, that this is legitimizes his ability to impose sanctions and secondary sanctions on other people. So I think that is what we're seeing. It's partly a sort of attempt to bypass the legal problems, that actually this is the preserve of Congress is supposed to issue tariffs, decide on tariffs. He has many other executive powers, but this one is with Congress. So I think that is probably explains what we're seeing. And these powers are wending their way through to the Supreme Court. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's not too long before the Supreme Court reasserts the right of Congress to have overall control over this aspect, i.e. revenue raising and tariffs, is there preserved under the Constitution. So we're going to see these come through. And so he's being, I think, very meticulous in saying there's an emergency and a threat to our nation by Russia. I mean, it's nonsense. There isn't a threat to the US from Russia. But I think it's all about finding a way around this legal problem before the, if you like, Supreme Court rules against him.
Sure. And I wanted to pull up, because I'm curious if this has any effect at all on Russia, because some have surmised, Alastair, that Lindsey Graham is running the foreign policy show in many respects for the Trump administration. And his comments are very, especially on social media, but just in general, have been very instructive. He talks about how he completely understands and applauds Donald Trump's decision to hit India with the 25% tariff because India insists on purchasing Putin's oil to prop up the war machine, allowing the bloodbath in Ukraine to continue. And he's put the world on notice, Trump has, that if you continue to buy Putin's oil, you will no longer be able to have access to the American economy. Well done, Mr. President. You are the strong and decisive leader the world has been waiting for to end the Ukraine conflict. Does this have any impact on Russia, Alastair? Because if you listen to Lindsey Graham, he would convince you, or attempt to convince you if he's unconvincing, that it does.
It certainly does have an impact on Russia. And one of the aims of this meeting with Witkoff, which has just taken place, for the Russians, was to understand actually what are the limits of power that are imposed on the president. It's quite clear that he is, to a certain extent, entrapped. The Epstein case, it shows no sign of lying down and dying. In fact, it's metastasizing all the time into something more extensive. And he is having problems with his MAGA supporters. It started off with the attack on Iran, which they didn't like because they felt, this is exactly what Trump said. He promised no more Middle East wars, no more, I'm not going to start any wars. I'm not going to do that. And then he attacked unprovokedly and in a surprise attacked Iran, if you like. Out of the blue, more or less. In fact, it was concerted to a certain extent with Iran, but it was out of the blue. And they were supposed to start negotiations on the following Sunday with Witkoff, who was already sort of preparing to go there for further talks. And then, bang, they were attacked. So what they're asking is, in effect, what Putin, and I'm putting it in much more boldly than Putin, who's very careful in his language, would say, but they are questioning who really is in charge of the United States. Is Trump in charge? Is he able to do things? Is he in charge in the sense that he has the capacity, he can say things and mean things and then do things? Otherwise, what's the point in the relationship? That's what a relationship is about. Both sides have to have confidence that the other side says things that they mean and that they're able to implement. And after all, at this stage, even in the baby steps that we had at the beginning, normalization of the relationship between states largely starts off by the simple things. You have embassies. You have embassies and diplomats are posted to each other's states, and you have aircraft flying between them. None of that has happened. Nothing. And so there are those in Russia who say, well, is he serious? And if he's serious, why doesn't he do something? And I've said before, one of the things that would be so obvious to do is all the pressure coming from Europe to fire missiles to the extent of Russia, deeper and deeper into Russia. Well, that is based on a presidential finding by Biden that authorized the CIA to mount, if you like, missile attacks into the depth of Russia. Well, it wouldn't be very difficult for Trump to come up and say, well, yeah, there was this finding during the last administration, but who knows, it could have been signed by the auto pen. I don't even know that it's valid. So I've told the CIA to stop it, but it doesn't happen. So Russia looks and they think, is he really able to come to an agreement? What is entrapping him? What is stopping him? And the first answer to that question is that the Senate is trying to stop him. These bills that are being put up, there's one just put up last week they've put into a spending measure, which was put into existing spending measures for a further $1 billion to go to Ukraine. Well, MAGA won't be happy with that at all. They won't like that. You said no more money going to Ukraine on the campaign trail. And he can't really stop it because there is quite a strength of opinion in the Senate, particularly, and among some Republicans. And what we're talking about here, just to be very blunt, really, this is a struggle for, in the Republican Party, for control of the Republican Party and to wean away the MAGA support from Trump and to return, if you like, the Republican Party to being a uniparty, as it was, the country club elite running the Republican Party, not the deplorables in the Rust Belt of America. So yes, how much is that? How much room does he have then to negotiate? How much latitude is there? That was what they were hoping to find out at this meeting that just took place with Witkoff in Moscow.
Yeah, and Alastair, if you could talk about now what you make of Russia's approach overall, not just in the latest talks, but also just what we've seen in response to what has been, as you have said, almost like a fruitless endeavor around normalization and, of course, around getting to some real negotiations about settling the conflict. The Western mainstream media has been very much in panic about Russia's gains on the battlefield. Russia, Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and the rest have been very clear on their terms. So talk about if you see Russia at all budging on its terms and how recent developments have been informing or lacking in informing on what Russia's approach is here.
Well, first of all, I think has been, his team has really led a very misconceived approach to this whole exercise. The faction that is led by Kellogg has been absolutely adamant on a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire. And then afterwards we can talk. Apparently Kellogg reportedly bases this on the sort of career experience where, suddenly the contact line became the line and it was settled. And then they said, well, we'll negotiate an agreement between the two Koreas later. Well, here we are, how many years later? And there's no agreement. And there was no political solution. Putin understands that. And he understands that the aim of this is to provide the United States with a sense of victory. That if the conflict is so-called frozen, they keep saying it's a frozen conflict. It's not been a frozen conflict. It isn't a frozen conflict. The front line is moving every day. But they've insisted it's a frozen conflict. And the purpose of that freezing of the conflict is to preserve enough of rump Ukraine, that they can then rearm, come back and attack and be a platform for further attacks on Russia. And, no one in Russia accepts that. They all understand that exactly, that's what the Western intent is to sort of, if you like, preserve enough and to have a ceasefire and to put NATO in to sort of monitor it. So while they, bring in NATO training, NATO weapons, and then prepare, Putin was fooled by that once. He's not going to be fooled by that again. And I was in Russia not so long ago, and the mood is quite changed. The Russians as a whole, and I was partly in St. Petersburg, which is a very liberal capital, but everyone understands now exactly that, the West is just using this Ukraine pretext to position itself to try and further undermine and weaken Russia. And so there's a huge support. I mean, people say, oh, well, it's not supported and everything. That's nonsense. You only have to look at the voluntary conscripts applying to join the Russian army. I mean, if it was suffering badly, if it was failing, people wouldn't be volunteering 35,000 a month like that to join the Russian army. You would be going off and finding something else to do. But that's what's happening. And so there is support for Putin. They understand that Putin is, if you like, playing chess with the whole of NATO and with the Western world, and that he has to prevail because it's an existential need of Russia to prevail in this conflict.
Yes, and how much then, Alastair, is the ceasefire talks then, or ceasefire talk when it comes to the U.S., NATO side, Ukraine side? They talk about it far more than Russia talks about it, especially of late. You wrote in your latest piece about how Russia is seeking to comprehend the various constraints on Trump. You wrote that Ukraine was on a path of a slow fuse self-destruction, I think you put it as. And so talk about the condition of Ukraine in this respect, and of NATO and the U.S. side, because I'm wondering if ceasefire talks are more about them, more about their situation than about Russia's particular needs and desires.
Well, of course, I mean, Europe and the United States are desperate that there shouldn't be a great defeat, that it shouldn't be like Kabul, and the sort of fall of Kabul and the terrible scenes of the, fleeing out of Kabul, that shouldn't be repeated from Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. But certainly the Ukraine is under their military forces are effectively in the first stages of collapsing. Particularly Pokrovsk is the hub, the center of it, but it extends up the whole line. And you recall Hemingway's old anecdote, old adage about bankruptcy. He was asked what bankruptcy was like, and he said it starts off slowly, 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 and then very fast. And there are signs that things are already becoming very fast. There's a great deal of disillusion amongst the military commanders. They don't like to be told, you've got to defend this village to the last man, when the Russians simply are overpowering in numbers and in military support. So it is on the point of collapsing. Does Trump understand this? Maybe he's occasionally made comments about the fact that maybe it will be the military situation that will define the outcome. And he's right on that. That's right. It is going to be decided on the battlefield, not in a negotiation between in Istanbul. It'll be decided on the battlefield. The details, maybe, yes, will have to be sorted out in Istanbul. But yes, it will be decided on the battlefield, and it's looking as if it's getting closer and closer to a final resolution, a denouement of this conflict. And that's why he's so desperate to get something that can be presented to the American public as, America won again. We haven't been defeated. We really won in this, and Russia has been weakened by this whole process. I mean, of course, it's just nonsense, but increasingly the West relies on narratives rather than facts on the ground to persuade people. We can always construct or craft a narrative to suggest that it may look like defeat, but really it was a win. But it's becoming less and less credible, and everyone understands that. And Europe, in particular, is in a sort of state of despair over it, because so much of the EU, their ability to preserve the EU, hinges around the sort of rallying around the flag of Ukraine, pretending that Ukraine is somehow Europe, which it isn't, but pretending it's somehow Europe against the terrible Slavs. I mean, it's just an identity politics that was first started by Zbigniew Brzezinski back in the 70s when he wrote his great chessboard and said, whatever we do, if Ukraine is part of Russia, then Russia may end up controlling the heartland of Asia. If Russia without Ukraine is just a regional power. So the purpose of American policy is to make sure that Ukraine is outside of the sphere, the geographic, the military sphere of Russia. That is our aim, and that's what's being pursued. And the ceasefire talk is just a tool to that end.
Yeah, and I'm so glad I have you here today, Alastair, because I haven't even covered this to a certain degree, but I wanted your analysis of the situation then with Vladimir Zelensky. As I said before, it appears Ukraine is talking a lot about ceasefires, talking a lot about after the war of late. He's been having talks with Trump, with the EU, with Ursula von der Leyen regularly. And I just wanted to highlight this part. Ukraine seeks a real and fair end to this war. And of course, emphasizing the importance of Europe, as has been the case. But it's this language talking about after the war that is much more common. Talk about Zelensky's position and why Zelensky might be talking more and more about after the war now than at any point of its tenure.
Because there's been a sea change in Ukraine, and defeat is now apparent to all of the military, Ukrainian military. It's even apparent to European military leaders. They can see that, the defeat is inevitable. How long it'll come, and they're just trying to slow it down and try and find some way of, postponing it or pushing it back sufficiently so there will be, something left that they can then build into another, if you like, NATO proxy in Ukrainian territory. But of course, this is why the special operation was cast from the beginning to say that Ukraine has to be neutral and that its ability to have arms and weapons will be limited, and it will have to eschew any attempt to join NATO. So these are the red lines of Russia, and I think Putin will continue, but it may not be so long till we get near to that sort of level. And Zelensky is casting around, threshing around, trying to find a solution out of this. But there isn't a solution out of this because, these are, events. These are the events on the ground. Ukraine is losing the war. Russia is slowly taking the key hubs and the military, if you like, strategic positions. And will soon be on the Dnieper and maybe even in Kiev. And then, what's he going to do? Go into government in exile or something? Well, all of that is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next. Russians probably have a better idea than certainly I do. But, we're going into a sort of new territory. And this is unsettling the West deeply. And therefore they threaten and they bluster and they say, oh, this has got to be done. But most of this is, as we say in English, water off a duck's back in the case of Putin.
Yeah, and and that's what I wanted to ask you about next is what exactly is happening to Zelensky. Even Kiev Independent, Ukrainian media is talking about his popularity sinking. Of course, there were these protests that were about institutions that were set up almost to prop up the Ukraine war, like NABU, and yet it's those who are supportive of that who are protesting him because of moves he made around these so-called anti-corruption agencies. So what is happening? It feels like things are imploding, but what is your understanding of that?
Well, it's very hard to make any sort of transition in Ukraine because right from the outset of this crisis, Maidan, and even before, even going back, if you like, to the end of the Second World War, the Western intelligence services, CIA, MI6 particularly, were putting in, if you like, very nationalistic, radical nationalists into the key positions in the military, the intelligence, and the police, precisely to stop them, if you like, at any stage coming to some sort of agreement with Russia. And they're still there, and they still have considerable power, and they still have power over Zelensky. So it's very hard for the next stage, if you like, the baby isn't being easily born of the next stage to Ukraine. And Zelensky's trying to keep it all, the support for him, the money flowing, the weapons flowing, so he can pretend, that there's a chance maybe in the future sometime we can get back Crimea and all of these other territories if only you will come to our aid. But I mean, essentially, a defeat is a defeat. And, it has large consequences, psychic consequences on your people. And so, he's trying to manage that not very successfully. And I think the West is casting around for who they'd like to have in his place. But there isn't really a very obvious example. And of course, behind him stand really, the nationalist zealots who may not be willing to let him go. I mean, telling him, you go forward, you're on the front line. And behind him stand the bayonets.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very good points, Alastair. And then my final question before moving on to another part of the world, Alastair, is this. As a former diplomat with a lot of understanding and experience in this field, a lot of audience members ask me and ask guests of mine, well, why then does Russia, as you said earlier, that Russia is going to settle this on the battlefield? Why does Russia emphasize so much diplomacy, even diplomacy with the United States, whenever it becomes available? How does this benefit or serve to not benefit Russia? What's your understanding?
I think the first thing I would say is that, I, as a person who's done these negotiations, it's always essential to keep a channel of communications open, to have some ability to communicate with your adversaries or with the other side, if you like. So I think it's very important to do that, because sometimes, events can lead up almost to the brink of war because of a misunderstanding, a stupid sentence, misunderstood or something. I've been in that situation where something nearly exploded and everything went to pieces, and it was just a misunderstanding that existed. So channels of information, channels of communication are important. But I think, what you have to understand and what your viewers, I'm sure, understand, Putin is not fighting the Kiev. He's fighting the collective NATO. All of it, many parts of it are in Ukraine. Of course, the support, the intelligence support, the weapons have been crucial. NATO is fully engaged in this process. And he is also trying to manage the question of the global South, an opinion in the global South, opinion in India, in China. China is well on side with Russia, but he has to think about, the overall big picture. And I think in that context, he's very conscious of the sensitivity of the American psyche. When there's a big rehearsal, oh, that's 9/11, Pearl Harbor. Oh, what are we going to do? They have to do something. So he tries to do it slowly, slowly, slowly. But nonetheless, I mean, you shouldn't see that purely in a Western way. Westerners like to think of military thrusts, a tank column driving through the lines. They think of what happened in Iraq, even though that's misunderstood, but they think of, the Desert Storm and, going through and smashing by a big thrust. Whereas Russia puts pressure right across the line, all the points, not all together all at once, but pretty well all together, maybe back a bit, then back forward, but the pressure accumulates and accumulates until instead of a thrust going in the middle, the thing just decomposes, just disintegrates under the sort of widespread pressure. So the strategy is quite different from how NATO or the West understand it, and that leads to misunderstandings. But Putin has always, and Russia's been very clear, this is an existential threat to us. And the answer to it is we have to have and discuss. And they're willing to discuss it. They even put out papers, I think in December 23, saying we need to have a proper security architecture in Europe. And I think that this must be perfectly obvious to everyone who's watching this video. We do need that because none of us want to end up in something that escalates into a nuclear war.
And then finally, as I said, finally, before getting on to the next part of the world, last question on this, Alastair, is this: do you find that some of my channel have been on here and said that, you know, the only way to enforce that kind of security architecture, the only way to address the root causes, as Russia has put it, to fully achieve demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, is to essentially move into a mode of not only breaking down the front lines, but taking Odessa and then moving even forward, even to the point of where political control in Kiev is dictated by Russia. Do you see it this way, or is there another path out of this?
Oh, of course. Of course, I mean, Russia, I don't know. Of course, I'm not privy to their plans. But, you know, Odessa is the key to the Black Sea. And the West and NATO have been trying to get hold of the Black Sea for a long time, for 200 years or so. It's been and would be, of course, if the West held Odessa, there would be a direct threat to Crimea. So I would think it would be unlikely that they would leave that. How far they go, I mean, I think, you know, I've been in situations, I mean, I'm not a military person, but I've been in Afghanistan. It's amazing how quickly when something, it's like an avalanche. You know, you start off with a little change and then suddenly things slip and slip and slip. And you know, you shouldn't, you know, once it breaks down, it can break down very quickly. It may take longer or it may be shorter, but, you know, the pressures that Russia is putting on it is precisely that, to get to the point at which there is systemic collapse, not just of the military, but systemic collapse of the whole structure of the extreme nationalists in Kiev and the whole system. And when that is done, then, you know, I think Russia will sort of pull back a bit and we will see who comes forward and wants to take on the job of sort of restoring, I mean, Ukrainian restoring, you know, normal life, which is what everyone is wanting in Ukraine, to return to Ukraine under something like an effective government.
Yeah, and the question is can the combined West, the collective West, accept such a scenario?
No. No, but they may have to. I mean, you know, that's the end of it, is that they may have to. And, you know, you have to put up with it. They have to put up with what happened in Kabul. You know, that's life. This is, you know, this is what facts in the battlefield mean. You know, if you're defeated, and it's painful. You have to pick yourself up, pull yourself together, and accept it. It is going to be very hard, harder for the Europeans than for America, because they've suffered a whole series of humiliating defeats in the financial field. And the European Union, you know, really only has this glue. It's a very strange glue because it's an artificial identity that has been put together to give this glue, but they only have this glue. And once that falls, you know, you'll have the Baltic states going in one direction, you have Italy and Spain, and the Mediterranean states saying, no, we want to go and have good relations with Russia. We'll have many Germans saying, let's restart the Nord Stream. And the EU will not survive that, I think.
Yeah, I just remember the last time I was in Europe a couple of years ago, and seeing just how invested Europe at all levels, whether it's in the streets of Berlin or in Brussels, you see just how inundated Europe is and invested in this conflict. And as you said, it's so directly connected to their economic life now that pulling out is going to be very challenging. But Alastair, I wanted to now.
But can I just wanted to interrupt before you leave the
Sure.
subject.
Yeah, sure.
What you say is true of the elites of the establishment.
Yes, exactly.
It's not true of the people.
Yep.
You know, there is not a clamor for war with Russia in Europe. This
Right.
is a fiction. I mean, you know, I live here in Italy, and I can tell you, no one's, you know, sort of gagging to go to war with Russia at all. And everyone's feeling the economic pain. And, you know, they despise those elites in Brussels. They really dislike them, and they know the elites despise them back. This is the rift. So it's not all of Europe
Totally.
in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the sense is. And because, you know, like a traveler like me, you're going to be in those tourist areas, in where that kind of capital is. And that's where the messaging, the shaping of the narrative, you just see it all around. That's how they're trying to, and they failed to convince people that this is a worthwhile project. And heck, it's almost been 3 years now, and I think the results speak for themselves. Alastair, now to move on to West Asia, the last time we spoke was before the 12-day war, as it's being called now, between Israel, U.S. and Israel and Iran. And now we're in a situation post that cessation of hostilities. Israel appears out of control. I know you've been following developments with Israel very closely. And, you know, because right now we have Israel essentially at war with Ansar Allah. We have Israel at war still in Lebanon, committing near daily strikes there. And the situation in Gaza has become so untenable, unfathomable in its brutality and destruction. So your assessment of the situation in West Asia as it pertains to this project that Israel and the United States are pursuing there?
Well, I don't want to make too much of it, but I did go on Iranian television sometime before that and say an attack was coming from Israel, and it would likely be a decapitation attack. And that was just some time before. And I don't think this conflict is over. I know that Iran also believes that there will be another round of escalation at some point, and are preparing for another war with Israel. Not in the immediate future, perhaps, but you know, they are rearming, getting air defenses sorted out, changing the structure, the command structure. There's a new command structure just been announced to bypass, if you like, the strategic defense system that was too cumbersome. So they are thinking in those terms. The issue is, I think, too complicated to go into in the time we've got. But if there is another strike on Iran, on its nuclear sites, Natanz, Isfahan, etc., it will be pointless, because it seems, and Israel and the United States have agreed, that most of the enriched uranium was either removed before is accessible to the Iranians. It's not going to be complicated to restart the system. It's not going to need great big, you know, centrifuge holes to do it. It can be done in a very small way and just as effectively if they wish to. And that is a decision that we will see. If they are pushed really hard by the Europeans with snapback, That is the provision in the JCPOA to restore and make mandatory all the sanctions on Iran. Again, there is this provision. Europeans said they will enact that, will trigger that provision. If that happens, then I think we'll see Iran leave the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. It takes about 3 months to leave it, but they will probably leave it at that point and will become effectively an ambiguously defined nuclear state. So I think that's where we will probably be going with Iran in that time. On the question of Gaza, it's been a case really that, again, we spoke about it earlier, but Trump seems to be trapped by Israel firsters in America and by Israel itself. To begin with, it looked as if Witkoff would be really, a bull in a china shop and would go and really, get a ceasefire. Hasn't happened. He can barely even get, end the famine, the starvation of people in Gaza. And all that we see at the moment, I think it's going to be happening about now. There's supposed to be a security cabinet meeting in Israel starting soon, which will be the decision to occupy Gaza militarily. Even though that, and this is explicit now in the narratives in Israel, even though that means probably the deaths of the remaining live hostages held in Gaza by Hamas. And the chief of defense staff is opposed to this. And there are others in the defense and security establishment who say this is going to be an appalling decision. It's going to be a defeat. Israel is going to be defeated in Gaza and are opposed to this. But it looks as if Netanyahu will ram this through, the decision to, if you like, occupy Gaza. What that's going to mean, is basically the ghettoization of Gaza preparatory to the removal of Palestinians out of Gaza. A grim, grim prospect. But the military, they don't have the resources. Their troops don't really believe in the mission. They are tired. Many of them are reservists and are unhappy at serving. And so there is a great division in Israel about this process. The hostage families, clearly, for obvious reasons, are deeply disturbed because an attack on us would be an attack on those areas too, where Hamas are believed to hold hostages. So at that point, they will probably be killed. And so they're deeply despairing. And there's a movement trying to stop the government from doing this. But Netanyahu says if the chief of defense doesn't like its instructions from the cabinet, he'd better go and get out. So they seem very determined to move ahead. And why? Because Netanyahu wants to get through this period to the summer recess, and then beyond that to elections, perhaps now likely in 2026, which will keep him out of court and out of problems with the law. He has certain corruption proceedings against him. But it's left with huge divisions. There is something like 519 former heads of Mossad, which is the intelligence service, and Shin Bet, the security service, who've signed a letter saying, this is crazy. This is a great mistake. We should do a deal, get the hostages out, and find and end the war in Gaza. That is unprecedented in Israel to have something like 500, includes the heads of like Pardo, the head of the Mossad, Ami Ayalon, the head of Shin Bet. Signing up this letter saying this is crazy. But nonetheless, the right are intent on doing this and are pursuing it. And there seems to have a sort of something of there seems to be an operative structure somewhere that supports Netanyahu and supports the right in this proposal, because it's against what we always thought of as the Israeli establishment, which was the Ashkenazi, European-leaning elite of Israel, who are more or less, they're not against it, because overall the polls show a overwhelming proportion of Israelis say they would like to see the Palestinians starved. I mean, that's the poll that's come out. You can see it in the Israeli press. So it's a very, very fraught time on the cusp of a possible sort of breakdown of society. And there's not a sense that, it's beginning the questioning. I mean, what is the purpose? What is the aim of Israel? I mean, is Israel going to simply become a state that exists by endless wars, endless killing, endless massacres like we've seen in Syria? Is this the solution to it? Well, of course, Trump talks and says, well, I really want, everyone to join the Abraham Accords, of course, and support
Yeah,
Israel.
he just said that, right? He said everybody needs to. All right, continue. Sorry.
And so I mean, yeah. But I mean, what does this mean? Actually, there are no Abraham Accords being agreed, because the old idea, Abraham Accords were supposed to be negotiated and, if you like, a peaceful agreement to normalize with Israel in some form, cold or warm or hot, didn't matter, but normalize with Israel. But now this is, if you like, Abraham's Accord normalization imposed militarily with there's no account taken of opposition. So they just push on, and you either take Israel's turn or we will attack you militarily. And that's the position that we're seeing in the region. And of course, what happened on the 13th of June and the 22nd of June in Iran. I mean, Iran is still there and still a strong, powerful state. And this bothers the Israelis greatly. So there's great pressure to try and persuade the Americans, if you like, to finish the job. What does finish the job mean? They want to turn Iran into a balkanized state with the Kurds and the Baluchis and the Azeris all fighting each other, and the state incapacitated and unable to exert any political influence in the region. But actually what happened as the result of the attacks on the 13th was a huge show of unity of Iranians. I mean, unbelievable. If you saw the videos you won't have seen them in the West, but the videos of the funerals of the people who had been killed during the, if you like, sneak attack by Israel. I mean, they were incredible. And the young people, absolutely part of it. People that, many in the West say, well, they were alienated from the government. They are not. They're fully behind it, and they're fully behind the supreme leader has emerged as an icon, as a rock star in all of this.
Yeah, well, I do have a bit more time, Alastair, if you had the time to flush out some of this, because I think it's really important. Earlier, as you were talking about the potential of a full-scale occupation of Gaza, it made me think about this whole notion of Greater Israel that especially the Likud party is very much committed to. And I wanted to ask you, though, is this even possible? Because whenever I read news about what's going on here, yes, there's the destruction, there's the famine, there's the genocidal consequences of Israel's war. But then there's also the resistance, which you've sat with these groups, you have worked, diplomatically. What is your take on the resistance right now? Because it seems like they're still fighting back. They're not going to lay down their arms for a deal that is going to essentially wipe them away, which has been proposed. So is any of this even possible? It just feels like an untenable situation. And it seems like what you're saying is that the divisions inside Israel, while they're not necessarily humanitarian, they are reflective perhaps of this fact. I'm curious if you would agree with that and what your assessment is.
This is, I mean, precisely why the chief of defense staff, who's on the field in Gaza, and he's not an Ashkenazi left-wing person at all. I mean, on the contrary, he's messianic. He was chosen, he says, I'm messianic. It's not me saying that. He says it about himself. He's part of the, the sentiments that you hear expressed by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others, those that believe in a sort of apocalyptic outcome that will create Israel, greater Israel, through military means. And so we're dealing, you can't approach this and understand this simply by, Western rational thinking. We're talking about eschatological thinking. It's about thinking about, that goes back to the Talmud and even before that. So we're talking about thinking which is based on the absolute belief that God's word and God's decisions will be imposed. We're back. I mean, this is now a religious war in many ways, and there are the rabbis, particularly those that are associated with the settlers, support this idea. So they say very clearly, that it's perfectly just to kill men, women, and children in Gaza. There are no innocents in Gaza. And they make that clear. And they regard the Palestinians as having no souls and therefore little more than beasts. And so, you can't put it in the same form of understanding that we're used to of seeing this as a sort of ethnic thing that needs to be found a middle way, and that Palestinians and Israelis have got to find some sort of structure which they can live together in. They don't want to live together with Palestinians. They want to see the Palestinians gone. They want to see the Arabs, apart from those that accept vassalage, gone from Greater Israel. And they see this as something that is coming about, therefore, not by a sort of careful, rational, Western type of, but is this doable, and is this Western, can you see this work? Because that's not the question. They look forward to the final battle, the Armageddon. And they've said that very clearly. People like Smotrich, I remember seeing a video of his from several years ago, and Smotrich was saying very openly, and he said, listen, we're doing what we can. But until we can get a judicial reform, i.e. a change in the judicial constraints through the system, what we really need is a big crisis or a big war. And then we can finish the project of Greater Israel. So we're talking about a very different, sets of belief and sets of understanding of the world. And they don't come together. And the West tends to look at these things simply in terms of strategy and who has power here, who has power there. Let's, cut it in half. It's not. It's something quite different. And you're dealing, if you like, with the people in the Palestinians who are prepared to sacrifice, even sacrifice their lives and their children for the sake of their people in the future, even if they're not going to be there to see it. This sort of sense of self-sacrifice is something that Westerners find almost impossible to comprehend. How can this be? I mean, we live in a hedonistic world, This is not how we see it. We see it in terms of utilitarian interests of human beings. But this doesn't exist in this part of the Middle East at this time. It's eschatological, and they are moving in that direction. What can stop it? Self-destruction, essentially self-destruction. Will they take it to the point at which Israel will self-destruct? Because ultimately, at the end, facts do matter, events matter, and things may end up in the form of self-destruction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And then we saw this, just to go back to even Iran, with this attempt. I mean, we've seen with Israel, the Greater Israel Project, since October 7th, since October 8th, plus Israel has, it's expanded to Syria. It's tried to get rid of Ansar Allah. It's tried to do everything to ensure this Greater Israel Project continues. But then with Iran, what we saw was a very fast-moving and brief military conflict, which, while I had many people saying, oh, well, look at the big blows Iran took, we saw Israel take quite many big blows. So big, in my estimation, that I think not only was the imagery quite powerful that was coming out, but also Israel's reaction, which was to try to institute a blackout completely of any information coming out of what the impact of Iran's response to them was. So what does this tell you, Alastair?
That the operation on the 13th of June may be seen by some as a very slick, sophisticated operation by Israel against Iran tactically. But strategically, it was an utter failure, because the purpose of this decapitation of the line commanders of the military and of the scientists and of the insertion of MEK and Kurdish operatives into Iran to fire anti-tank missiles and missiles at air defenses was supposed to collapse Iran like a house of cards. Washington is enamored of what happened, first of all with Hezbollah and in Syria. And they imagined the decapitation was going to bring about the complete collapse of the state of Iran, and they would be immobilized, unable to act, unable to do anything in response. And they got it completely wrong, because what happened was, yes, there was about 8 hours in which there was confusion, and there was the air defenses didn't work for about 8 hours because of a cyber attack. The Iranians fixed that. They appointed new commanders. Supreme leader took command, and they retaliated. And they retaliated very severely. Israel was attacked as it's never been attacked before. It's even now unwilling to admit to what the damage was inflicted on strategic targets, but it was inflicted absolutely accurately on those targets. And so strategically, it was a complete defeat for Israel. And in fact, I saw a senior Israeli diplomat was speaking just now and said, our entire security structure was completely defeated on the 13th of June in front of the whole world. That is how serious it was. What was the damage to Iran? Well, they lost people, and people are very, Iranians, of course, were sad about that. But in fact, it's brought the whole nation together and given it determination and strength. And they are preparing for the next round. And, much of what you've read about it, probably not time to go into it here, but another occasion, they didn't destroy all the air defenses, and they didn't even really fly over Iran. Actually, they had to fly around Iran. They flew into Azerbaijan, and from Azerbaijan, they were flying standoff missiles into Iran. So what was the damage? I would say, on the contrary, it was supposed to, if you like, bring down a house of cards, instead of which it's done the opposite. It stood up a more empowered and more confident Iran than existed before.
Yeah. I mean, with a hubris-ridden state like Israel, you would think that during those 12 days, as they were claiming to have dominance over the skies of all of Iran, that they would demonstrate this in their propaganda. But we didn't see that, Alastair. We didn't see that. And last question for you as we close here. You mentioned self-destruction of Israel may be the only thing that stops Israel. What does that look like exactly?
We don't know. I mean, I don't have that sort of crystal ball. They can be very different. I mean, look what's happened to Syria. That was, it did just collapse suddenly. Not unexpectedly. I mean, not unexpectedly to Iran or to Russia, who had foreseen what was coming and tried in some ways to stop it from happening. But Turkey and Israel inserted the forces of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, into Syria. I'd seen all this before, and I realized what a disaster this is going to be for Syria, because I saw in Afghanistan, when I was dealing with it long ago, when the first I saw Al-Qaeda arrive, the Wahhabists arrive in Afghanistan. Before that, most of Kandahar, the south of Afghanistan, Gilgit in the north of Pakistan, they were Sufi, the Gilanis, Mujahideens, etc., etc. Once those sort of Salafist, single-minded forces they weren't ISIS or even Al-Qaeda. I met bin Laden then, but even those forces, they came in. What's happened now? Well, look, Kandahar, all around Pakistan, there's no diversity. There's no plurality. It is just single-minded, if you like, Salafist thinking that tolerates no differences and insists that everyone must follow a single model of Islam. And that's what happened in the areas around Afghanistan. That's what's happening in Syria, and what will continue, unfortunately, very sadly, continue in Syria.
Well, Alastair, it was so great to be with you today. We're going to end the show here. Everybody should be paying attention to Alastair's work, and you can do that by going to the video description after the show has ended. You can find his Conflict Forums Substack there. Hit the like button before you go. That helps keep the stream boosted in YouTube's algorithm so more people can hear our conversation today with Alastair Crooke. Alastair, any final words before we head out of here?
No. I think we've said enough.
Great. Well, hit that like button, everyone. Go to the video description to find Alastair's work, as well as all the places to support this channel. And we will have to do this again, Alastair, at some point in the near future. It was great to be with you. Take care, and we'll head out. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.